Before dawn, the pier was empty once again. Ludmilla sighed. Something she felt was beginning to happen far too often, as she stood inside the shadowed wooden doorframe of an emptied home. After a fitful night plagued by worries, she had risen from her bed an hour before sunrise to finish her preparations and tasks for the morning. In doing so, she hoped to head out early to find out more from the men that had arrived the previous evening as their families prepared for the day. Instead, she was greeted by the conspicuous sight of the empty pier upon leaving the manor. There was no sign of the ship down the river and, after rushing down to the shore, she noted no broken ropes nor signs of damage to the moorings that would indicate that the ship had been swept away somehow. It was only after she trudged back up to the village and looked around that she was able to piece together what had occurred. Two of the returned men had stolen away sometime during the night, taking their families with them. The first abandoned home she had come across was that of the man who barreled through her when the ship had bumped up against the pier. The second, in which she currently stood, belonged to the man handling the rudder that had slipped away during that same commotion. With the village as short-handed as it was, there was no watch posted at the harbor overnight and no one had noticed their departure. Peering into the living space, Ludmilla took a mental inventory of the interior. The home was stripped of bedding and clothing, the shelves and cooking area similarly bare. Clearly, the family had left with no intention of ever returning. Stepping back out into the path, she brooded over the increasingly dire situation that cast its shadow over the fief. The river was the village's lifeline to the interior of the duchy, so losing the vessel that was their main method of transport was a crippling blow. Over the recent generations, the borderlands of the Kingdom of Riestais had become a resurgent wilderness, turning Warden's Vale into an isolated outpost of the Duchy of Eranthal. The overland route leading north through the old roads and regrowth back to the western highway which led to the city would take heavily laden travelers nearly 2 weeks on foot with very limited capacity for cargo. The route also carried with it a high risk of being attacked by wild animals, wandering monsters and the occasional loose group of bandits or demi-humans. Fashioning a new vessel suited for transporting the barony's goods would similarly be impossible with what they had on hand. With the bounty of nature all around them, the people never suffered any shortfalls of food, but they still needed to trade in the city markets for tools, parts and other necessities that were crafted elsewhere. The city in turn would be lacking in the produce and resources, timber, furs, hides and other raw goods harvested in the south, that they would exchange in turn. Though the production of their mostly undeveloped fief was tiny compared to the vast farmlands and forests managed in the interior, it still served as a small link in a chain of logistics that could be adversely affected by their missing contributions. Not only would it cause uncertainty and hardship for others that depended on their trade, it would also create political ill will against them for the instability that their failure to deliver would cause. Ludmilla looked back outside, searching for signs that the others had become aware of what had occurred overnight and its implications. Occasionally a villager would come up the path, carrying water drawn from further upriver, out of sight of the harbor. They were all simply focusing on their morning routines, preparing for another busy day. By the afternoon, however, it would be common knowledge and the topic of every discussion. Ludmilla wondered what she should say when that happened. "Mistress, the priest was looking for you." A young woman coming down the hill with an empty pair of buckets latched onto a carrying pole called out to her. Ludmilla turned her head to look up in the direction of the voice. The woman's arm was stretched out to point further up the path, hand gesturing loosely. "Did he say what it was about?" Ludmilla asked. In reply, the woman simply dropped her gesturing arm and shrugged. With the morning's chores pressing her, she did not seem to express any interest beyond making sure Ludmilla was aware that someone was looking for her. Her pace did not slow as she rounded the hill on her way to the riverbank. As Ludmilla made her way back up further into the village, she shared a similar exchange with 3 other tenants on the same errand, but learned nothing new. This was how information traveled amongst the common folk who had no pages or couriers, tidbits being passed from person to person until it was seemingly no longer relevant. Whether it actually reached its intended, or unintended, recipient was something to be seriously considered in larger towns and cities, but in small villages it was a fairly effective way to spread word without interfering with the people's daily lives. Ludmilla found the priest standing outside his home near the top of the hill. One of the elders of the village, he had a thin, weathered appearance that spoke of his service as minister to the village for multiple generations. Aside from the icon of the 6 great gods that he wore around his neck, there was no real way to distinguish his plainclothes appearance from any other old man in the village. Wisps of white hair trailed loosely in the air as the old priest turned his head in Ludmilla's direction. He made no move to meet or greet her. An agent of the gods did not answer to mortals, after all. She came forward with the customary greeting, lowering her head as she curtsied. "I hope the day finds you well, Priest Bohadan." Awaiting his response, she did not straighten herself. The aged priest extended a shaky hand, placing it firmly on Ludmilla's lowered head. "Blessings of the Six be upon you, child." She felt a wave of warmth as the priest's blessing washed over her. Proper supplication before a divine agent was answered with a gift from the gods. As far as his congregation was concerned, the spell allowed one to perform their daily tasks with slightly greater proficiency as well as tending to avert minor accidents and injuries for a short period of time. Though mostly a ritual exchange, it still held a bit of practical value for the people. With the incidents as of late, Ludmilla felt she would need any help she could get, but when she raised her head to face the priest, she only saw more trouble painted on his face. "You sent word for me," she said. "What's the matter?" Ludmilla went straight to the problem at hand, but Bohadan seemed hesitant to respond. "The men that were carried in yesterday," he told her. "They passed away during the night." "What?" The exclamation came out sounding something like a squawk. Looking around to see if her outburst had drawn any attention, Ludmilla lowered her voice. "How?" "Of dehydration," the priest replied. "I could not discern any other cause." "Do you mean to tell me that men traveling on a river died of thirst?" Ludmilla was incredulous. "They did not go peacefully," Bohadan replied gravely. "Their eyes were wide open the entire time, but they seemed to be staring elsewhere. They moaned weakly through the night, thrashing at their surroundings until cuts and bruises covered their bodies and their fingers bled raw. We had to restrain the men to keep them from harming themselves further, but they still kept screaming in hoarse whispers until their throats cracked and bled and they could scream no more." The priest paused to swallow as he gave his report, a haunted expression on his face. "In all my years I have not seen the like," he said. "Just what happened to these men?" "That's what I would like to know," Ludmilla thought to herself. What could disturb grown men to such an extent that they would die of thirst while traveling on a pristine river? Resolving herself, Ludmilla stepped into the building to see what had happened with her own eyes. She wrinkled her nose as the pungent odor of herbal tinctures and soiled cloth greeted her. The priest's acolyte was watching over the bodies, sharing the same grim expression as her mentor. The corpses of the two men lay sprawled on their cots, woven straps binding limbs still rigid in death. Bloodied fingers formed into grasping talons around wherever they could find purchase, leaving shallow marks and dark red smears on the surrounding furniture. One man lay on his back, face covered by a clean linen cloth. The other had somehow become tangled in his beddings and bindings, face hanging out with a ghastly expression over the edge of the covers that he lay upon. Ludmilla knelt to inspect the man. Even in death, his eyes were still wide open, his pallid skin only lending to his horrified visage. She couldn't help but compare expressions between the corpse and its tender. Reaching out, she pulled a wooden cup from under the cot. It had rolled along the floor, leaving a trail of clear liquid near her feet. Moistened towels were scattered about as well. The priest and his acolyte had most likely tried to help the man take liquids, only to be met with violent resistance. Placing the cup on a nearby counter, she turned to face the two defeated-looking caretakers. "Could you make anything out in their delirium?" "Nothing," Bohadan replied. He kept glancing back and forth between the bodies in the doorway, as did his assistant. The night's vigil had left them plainly ill at ease, and they stayed well away from the apparent source of their anxiety. Ludmilla breathed a sigh yet again. There was no sense in lingering and nothing further could be learned here. The priest and his acolyte stood aside respectfully as she passed them on the way out, but were almost stepping into her heels in their haste to leave as well. Most of the villagers were out and about by now. Many were in or around their homes working on winter crafts, mending clothing or trying to fix odds and ends. There was less daylight in the winter months, so the majority of the activity was concentrated into the 7 or 8 hours of good light that reached their place in the valley. Further afield, there were dozens foraging outside of the village. Though none dared enter the nearby forests, with recent events casting a pall of uncertainty over the settlement, they were still comfortable enough to harvest the various plants that grew abundantly over the marshy valley floor. Watercress, arrowheads, mannograss and various reeds and rushes carpeted the terrain, but there were never enough hands to even remotely harvest it all. They also managed a flock of hundreds of grey geese, which dotted the vast feeding grounds, providing fowl and fresh eggs for the village on a regular basis. As well, there were a handful of men and women casting nets into the river for fish, eel, mollusks and crustaceans. With the seasonal conflict being so late this year, the winter markets would also experience the same delay, and the village was using this time to increase the quantity of their exports. Not that it could be delivered in a timely manner without their ship. The thought again made Ludmilla keenly aware of the slowly building mental pressure that had been accumulating since the previous evening. Giving her head a shake, she brought her thoughts back to the task at hand. With 2 dead and 2 missing, there was only 1 man left out of those who had returned. She was well acquainted with the man, her own brothers being of a close age with him, and he was often seen together with them during their childhood. Even now, he usually served as a sentry for the manor and had a place on the regular border patrols. Since she was familiar with the man, she had meant to see him first, but the events of the morning had simply swept her along powerlessly like some leaf in the current. He also had been the only one to walk away from the pier in a somewhat normal fashion, so she had hopes of getting some real information out of him. On the way down to his home, Ludmilla looked anxiously for signs of activity in his family's home. For a tense moment, she thought that he, too, may have fled, but the thin wisp of smoke that rose from his family's home dispelled those fears. Rapping her knuckles lightly on the thick wooden door, Ludmilla announced herself. "Malivage, it's me." It didn't take long for the door to open in response. The tall man appeared, almost entirely filling the doorway. He still had a haggard appearance, dusty brown hair unkempt, face unshaven, tired and worn, but at least some color had returned to him. Through a space between Malivage and the doorframe, she spotted his sister putting away breakfast. They seemed to be having a late morning, but she could hardly fault them for that after seeing what happened to the other men. For now, she was simply thankful that there was someone left to speak of what had occurred. Malivage seemed to sense what she had in mind, shifting uncomfortably and unable to meet her gaze. Ludmilla opened with a courtesy, regardless. "Are you well enough to speak for a while?" After a short silence, Malivage closed his hazel eyes and exhaled heavily. Stepping out of the doorway, he rested his back against the stony wall and slid down until he sat on the ground, nodding in acquiescence. Malivage's defeated actions gave Ludmilla pause. The entire situation since the previous evening had left her with an unstable feeling, like she was trying to cross thin ice, the people and world around her threatening to break apart with every step she took towards finding the answer to this mystery. She looked for a place where she could sit, but ultimately decided to step back down onto the path to speak with him face to face. Upon turning around, she was surprised to find that Bohdan had followed her. The presence of the knowledgeable elder was welcome, however, so she paid him no mind as she started to question the waiting guard. "What happened?" As the words left her mouth, Ludmilla felt that they were wholly inadequate. She wished she could reach out and snatch them out of the air so she could start over again, but Malivage still flinched as if he had been struck. The big man was already sitting flat against the wall, but he seemed to sink into the stone as he deflated upon being called to recount his experience. His words came out in a hollow voice, unlike the boisterous man of mere weeks ago. "We lost." He gave a short, weak laugh, but Ludmilla failed to detect any humor in his words. "Everyone, everything. All is lost. We are lost." At the gloomy outburst, Ludmilla furrowed her brow in confusion and felt a hint of distaste well up within her. Frontiersmen were a subdued and practical lot. The men and women of Warden's Vale were not prone to bouts of melodrama like some unskilled tavern bard. "Lost? How?" She pressed Malivage. "You should have barely arrived." For years now, the kingdom of Reistais and the Baharuth Empire regularly held a large skirmish around the autumn harvest season. Neither side would purposely commit to pitched battle, and the outcome was similarly indecisive. The casualties inflicted could barely be called damage, so tiny they were, compared to the nation's population of over 9 million. Each year, the great houses would play their games, and their vassals would try to figure out how to deal with all the logistical shortfalls it would cause. In line with the rather late declaration of war by the Empire, the king had raised his banners over a month previous. Since it was an expected occurrence by this point, Baron Zaradnik had already long prepared his quota of men and supplies and left that same week. Going by Malivaj's statement and the unexpected return of the men, this outcome should have occurred only a handful of days after their arrival at Urantal, barely enough time to finish setting up their camps and preparing for the initial skirmishes. Ludmilla couldn't accept this claim. With both sides putting minimal effort into the battle, it should have been a standoff that played out over many weeks, well into late winter, perhaps even spring. That should have been the point. After all, the longer the Empire lingered at Katza, the longer the kingdom's levies would be prevented from participating in the regular activities of the season. The autumn harvest had long been completed by the time the call to arms had been sent forth, so it seemed that the Empire had chosen to both stifle the busy winter trade and delay the spring planting season. It represented an aggressive shift in the Empire's strategy. Delaying the bustling winter markets in the region would have meant supplies would not reach the fiefs that needed them. The planting season, if postponed for long enough, would require that crops and livestock be organized in a drastically different fashion to account for lost weeks of growth, if they could be at all. To Ludmilla, this sudden move to throw the kingdom off balance indicated that the Empire was about to change the way they waged war sometime in the near future, but the idea that they would face such a drastically different result in the same year was beyond her ability to imagine. Malivaj, answer Mistress Ludmilla's question. Bohdan spoke gently to the man, trying to coax him to speak further. The priest leaned forward, laying his hands on the haunted-looking man. Ludmilla did not hear any spells being cast, but Malivaj seemed to visibly gather himself and started to speak again in a clear and regular tone. What followed was the account of a nightmare. It could be only that. Malivaj's eyes regained their focus as he finished his recollection, looking between Ludmilla and Bohdan as he ended his account. He seemed oddly calm, as if sharing his memories had distanced him from his experience somehow. Ludmilla shifted uncomfortably. There were so many points where she thought she should have questioned, but it was also fantastical and horrifying that she had refrained from doing so as the young man spoke. Even now, she was at a loss as to how to proceed. The tale was long, and the use of divine magic to eliminate Malivaj's fear and force lucidity upon his mind resulted in an eerie, distant account that spared them none of its gruesome details. Some of those, she could not even begin to understand, or perhaps words were simply insufficient to do so. Tens of thousands of men, falling to the ground dead as if a giant scythe had swept through them like so much grain. Colossal globes of liquid darkness that reigned over the field, birthing colossal, nightmarish creatures that could only be described in loose relation to more common things. The appearance of an undead caster who possessed the might to control those unfathomable monsters. She couldn't even guess at how many lives had been lost in the carnage. It was beyond the comprehension of a teenage girl living out on the edge of civilization with a science education and limited experience outside the borders of their isolated fief. Beyond what any of them knew. Even those villagers who had spent decades defending the border against the myriad of demi-humans and monsters from the wilderness had never recounted anything so bizarre, horrifying and deadly. But, Bohdan might know. The venerable priest had lived long and seen much, undergoing his training as an acolyte in the theocracy. A mentor and friend who had long served the barony and its people with his divine magic and generations of wisdom. Ludmilla turned to see if she could lean on his knowledge and experience, but her words caught in her throat as when she saw the ghastly expression painted on his worn face. "Spare us." The elderly priest was the first to break the silence that followed, with words barely audible as they passed his pale, thin lips. "May Sursana spare us." His voice rose as he invoked the grace of the god of death. The army of the kingdom, destroyed. The Empire, fighting on the side of abominable horrors and evil undead. His quivering voice continued to rise and Bohdan turned to face her. The feverish gleam in his eyes was so intense that she felt herself take a step back. "Mistress Ludmilla," he said, "we must leave." Ludmilla's mouth opened and closed, and she looked back and forth between the two men. Motioning for the priest to hold, she turned to Malivaj, who remained leaning on the wall of his home. "Malivaj, please get some rest." She touched him gently on the shoulder. "I'm sorry for asking you to remember all of that." Nodding in appreciation as she helped him from the wall, the young man turned to disappear back into the tiny earthen home, closing the door softly behind him. She wasn't sure how much longer the enchantment cast upon him had left, but she suspected that she had just condemned the man to the state that they had discovered him in yesterday, despite appearances. Stepping back onto the village path, she found the priest pacing back and forth on the narrow road, muttering to himself. Seeing her approach, he repeated his words. "Mistress Ludmilla," Bohdan said quietly, "we must leave." "What do you mean by leave?" His unexplained insistence was beginning to wear at her patience. "You are the village priest. This is the seat of House Zaradnik. We can't just simply leave this place." "No." His shout punctuated the morning air, then his voice returned to its normal volume. "No. Do you not understand, child? The royal army has been routed and broken. Iranthal was being abandoned. The Empire, with their new unholy allies, will sweep over these lands, employing the very devastation they have wrought. When they come, those horrors will shatter our minds and bodies just like those men that returned home. The undead show no mercy to anyone. Only death at the hands of this great evil awaits us if we stay." "But the Baron? The Baron and his sons are unaccounted for," he continued to press her. "This is a decision that you must make on his behalf. They would be powerless against what comes anyways, all of us would be. Everyone must leave, not just you and I, every man, woman and child must flee this place before it's too late." Ludmilla felt that the lingering dread that had hung over them since the previous day had, for the old priest, manifested into the same fear that came from the men in the boat. Ludmilla swatted away the same feeling creeping out of the corners of her own mind as she tried to calm Bohdan. "Perhaps it will not come to that," she said. "It would be reasonable for the kingdom to concede some territory in light of such a defeat, so it would not make sense for the Empire to cause such wanton devastation in their future holdings. Normally, when clashes happened between rulers, a decisive defeat would result in the concession of titles. The nobles managing the lands within those titles would owe their fealty to a new liege lord and continue to administer their fiefs under a set of obligations similar to the ones they had before. While she understood that recent changes had occurred within the highest levels of the Empire's administration, its territories were by and large run the same way as the kingdoms, through a hierarchy of aristocrats and capable proxies who managed their respective territories. Practically speaking, it meant very little to the common citizen, and for the nobles it would mostly mean that their taxes flowed to a different lord. No action would be taken against them as long as they administered well, upheld their end of the noble contract and observed the laws of the realm. In their case, Iranthal and its surrounding duchy, being the claim which provided the jasus belli for the annual confrontation, would be ceded, but life for the people would remain mostly unchanged. Bohdan remained unconvinced, shaking his head. "The risk is too great. Never in all my years have I even remotely heard of such a thing. This is no normal war." There was a short pause as the priest collected his thoughts, seemingly inspired by something. Ludmilla waited patiently while scanning their surroundings. So far, no one had taken note of the discussion. "This sort of magic that Malevich described, it is far beyond that of even great heroes. I have heard that the Empire has a legendary magic caster, Fluda Paradine. Only one such as he could have possibly done such a thing." Ludmilla plied her memory, trying to recall what she knew of magic. When her family paid their infrequent visits to the duchy's capital of Iranthal, she would associate with the other noble ladies that were in the city. The informal discourse of luncheons, afternoon viewings and evening events would cover topics ranging from frivolous to fruitful. As a young girl following her mother, she had soaked up everything like a sponge as children did. In recent years, while she still enjoyed the same topics as other young noblewomen, she was increasingly drawn to more practical subjects that would help her manage her family's domain. Regardless, discussions on magic were cursory at best. They were either related to divine magic, dealing with the state of the land or the well-being of the population, or a fanciful spice added to titillating tales of adventure spun by minstrels hired for their entertainment. Even then, she was probably more knowledgeable than her peers in this area. In his twilight years, Bohdan had become capable of casting divine magic of the third tier, so she was more familiar as to its use in a fief than most of the other ladies of the regional nobility. If he himself held this legendary caster in such estimation, she could hardly refute him. Bohdan's continued ruminations jarred her from her thoughts. What if the undead caster that Malevich saw riding that aberration was Fluda Paradine? It is said that he has lived for an unnaturally long time. I do actually recall his name being spoken of even when I was a boy studying in the theocracy. Perhaps he has given himself over to evil magics to become an elder lich? But that would mean the Empire has fallen in league with the enemies of the living. Fluda Paradine has been both mentor and advisor to generations of emperors. Ludmilla didn't know what an elder lich was, but the rest did sound genuinely dire. The Baharuth Empire was once a part of Riastais, and had broken away a decade before the founding of House Saradnik. If Fluda Paradine had been present, manipulating the courts of the Empire ever since the schism, it could be possible that the belligerence of the Empire was the result of his influence and long in the making. Bohodan had served as a trusted member of the Baron's Council since the time of her great-grandfather, a faithful servant of the gods and of the people that had come to rely upon him. There was no reason to believe he wasn't acting with the best interests of the barony in mind. "Then what do you propose we do?" Ludmilla asked. "If we flee west to the rest of the kingdom," Bohodan answered, "the horrors of the Empire will surely run us down along the way. The kingdom will be doomed, anyways. We must go south, through the upper reaches. We can escape to the theocracy. By the power of the Six, the theocracy will be able to stop this abomination." "This plan is heedless." Ludmilla's response was immediate. "You propose that we follow the river up its course to the southwest until we can find a place that is shallow enough to ford, after which we would need to turn southeast through the passes until we reach the slain theocracy. That is at least 200 kilometers of savage wilderness between Warden's Vale and the border of the theocracy, then another 100 kilometers to its nearest city. Rather than the gently rolling fields of the pastoral heartlands that someone unfamiliar with the region might be given to imagine, the southern reaches of Riastais were bordered by an ancient mountain range which was populated by a plethora of inhuman tribes. The regions further to the south were a windswept plateau dominated by shrublands, rocky moors and sparse woodland, but the area nearest to their territory and much of the kingdom's southern border was an imposing barrier range dense with primal forest. Though nowhere near the height of the towering, snow-capped Azalisia range to the north, the southern ranges were still high enough that their heights lay bare, their rugged peaks standing in stark relief to the deep valleys cutting through them. "Leading the entire village through that will take 2 weeks at the least," Ludmilla told him, "maybe a month if we encounter significant delays. Being caught and exposed to a late winter storm in the passes would surely be catastrophic. There are also the demi-human tribes and monsters that are in the area. They might not come after Warden's Vale very often, but they would not pass up the opportunity to attack a vulnerable caravan of refugees if it suits them. I cannot approve of this reckless course of action." Despite her words, Bohodan had not lost any of his momentum and the priest continued to press his case. Seeing this, Ludmilla motioned for him to follow, and together they walked back up the village lane to speak inside the manor hall. Pulling off her scarf, she went to the kitchen area at the back of her family's home to bring out 2 wooden cups filled with cool water. Ludmilla moistened her throat before picking up where they had left off. "You understand why I consider your plan unacceptable, yes?" "Mistress Ludmilla," Bohodan smiled reassuringly at her worries, "I understand the root of your concerns, but I think you are underestimating the people. Perhaps you've been influenced by other nobles on these matters, but surely you understand that frontiersmen are not the same as the folk of the interior." The wise priest was right, as usual. When she was still a child, she had gauged everyone by the same measure, believing everyone was the same in regards to what they were broadly capable of. As the years went by, however, she came to understand that this was simply not true. Because the Baron only brought his family to Erantal once or twice a year, the difference in physical ability displayed between visits was plainly apparent. Through friendly sparring and training between them, it became clear that the gap in ability between her brothers and the other noble scions of the duchy only grew wider with every season. By the time they approached marriageable age, they were looked up to as reliable cornerstones in matters of martial prowess. Even amongst the noble women, she could feel through simple interactions that she was a bit stronger, faster and more resilient than the other ladies of the ducal nobility. She wasn't sure if it was something to be particularly proud about, but it was a fact all the same. Since she could now often keep up with her brothers in their training and participated in wilderness patrols with few issues, Ludmilla suspected that she would also be able to best the young nobleman of the ducal court in combat as well. When inevitably approached by his children as to why this was, their father said it was due to a difference in heritage. The settlers of the borderlands were often descended from adventurers, and the original frontier nobles were powerful adventurers that had claimed the lands as their own by expanding and taming the borders of Riastais. Through maintaining these bloodlines and honing their strength against the dangers of the vast wilderness beyond, they were always notably superior to their peers in the more peaceful regions of the kingdom, at least when it came to martial matters. Ludmilla had at least one close friend from the inland territories who could fly circles around her in other subjects. The common people of their village were much the same, to a certain extent. In addition to being farmers, woodsmen, hunters and tradesmen, they were also fighters and rangers. By necessity, everyone was trained from a young age and involved in patrolling the border and defending the fief from the myriad threats that faced them. This militant culture resulted in a population that was generally stronger in combat than the citizens that lived in the interior, who focused primarily on their domestic tasks. Small demi-human tribes could not muster a force to intercept a caravan full of frontiersmen without a good chance of being instead destroyed themselves. They may have looked the same as every other human, but as Bohdan had reminded her, they were not the same as those from the kingdom's heartlands. Despite this, Ludmilla still had other doubts. Bohdan, however, pushed forward. "Besides, what other choice have we?" he said. "We will not outrun the Empire's forces if we flee west, and certain death lies to the north at Iranthal. We cannot cross the river eastwards and scale the sheer cliffs on the other side to reach the main highway between Iranthal and the Theocracy, so we can only go south." Ludmilla bit her lip. Truthfully, there seemed to be no good options. Instead, she reached for a compromise. If the capitulation of the kingdom is the objective of the Empire, then they should be moving westwards towards the royal capital to take advantage of their momentum and secure a quick victory. There's a good chance that they would ignore an out-of-the-way border territory like ours. We can put together a raft and set a watch down the river closer to the city. If they dispatch forces south, the rangers we send can sail back up the river faster than any soldiers can travel by land. If the Empire heads to the kingdom's heartlands, they can report back as well to give us some peace of mind. We can wait for the terms of settlement without having our spring activities interrupted." It was a proposal she was confident that the Baron would have approved. The frontiers of Riestais were sparsely populated and poorly developed. They presented next to no major military threat, especially when the levy had already been raised and there was relatively little remaining in terms of manpower that could be mobilized. Despite the loss at Katsa, the vast and wealthy interior and coastal territories in the west still had upwards to 4 million adult men. The Empire would have to strike quickly at the heart of the kingdom after successfully completing the siege of Iranthal before a response could be mustered, or face a number of challenges. The personal retinues of the great nobles and various mercenary companies would become involved as well, representing an even greater threat. Such an attack was considered an impossibility under normal circumstances. While the Empire's legions were a standing army of well-trained soldiers, they had nowhere near the numbers to occupy all of the territories that lay between. Even a successful siege of Iranthal was questionable, as relief would presumably arrive before the walls could be breached. In her mind, given the Empire's tendency to preserve the strength of their legions, their most reasonable course at this point was to pursue concessions after quickly scoring a series of decisive victories. Once terms had been settled, the territories in question would be sorted out in a diplomatic manner. In other words, rather than pointlessly taking such a monumental risk in crossing the wilderness before the shadow of an unrealized fear, she thought that they should only evacuate the villages when it was proven to be a threat. Bohdan remained stubbornly unconvinced, however. His wisps of white hair waved lazily about as he shook his head vehemently. "The legions of the damned care not for the customs of the living," he said. "They will hunt us with an untiring, unrelenting hatred no matter how many or how few we may be. The sooner we leave, the greater our chances of avoiding a terrible fate at their hands." "The legions?" Ludmilla raised an eyebrow. Though admittedly powerful, Malivage only saw one undead being riding on those beasts. "How did we arrive at legions?" Malivage saw only one. "Yes," Bohdan said. "But that doesn't mean there aren't more. There are always more. The fact that the Imperial legions were so far away and did not advance during the battle is already suspect. Perhaps they wished to conceal their true nature so as to not alert the population at large. A single feat of legendary might is far removed from the day-to-day reality of the people, but stories of being destroyed by endless waves of the undead would definitely warn them away far in advance of their arrival." Ludmilla took a moment to digest his words. In addition to the national catastrophe of the army being destroyed, The mounting irregularities put events beyond her scope of knowledge and experience as the Baron's proxy. She was barely piecing things together in her mind as they went. When Lord Zaradnik left with his men less than a month ago, she had been expected as the remaining member of the house to keep the daily affairs of the fief in order and at most deal with minor issues here and there. Not in her wildest imaginations did she expect that the regular routines of the season would come to this. Never mind navigating a safe route through the fiasco, she still struggled to even develop a clear picture of their situation. Erantle sits at a major trade hub between Baharuth, Riastais and the slain theocracy, she noted. News from the Empire of such a thing would have traveled far in advance by way of merchants and wayfarers. Never mind that, refugees would be swarming over the borders. Nations of millions do not simply fall to the undead overnight. Ah, but that is where you are wrong, Mistress Ludmilla. Bohdan immediately jumped onto the tail of her statement, raising a gnarled finger beside his head. Excuse me? Ludmilla blinked. What are you talking about? She could not keep the puzzled expression off of her face. Noble children were usually taught the history of the region to one degree or another, and she definitely did not recall anything like this being a part of it. Bohdan served in the role of tutor to House Zaradnik in several subjects, so her confusion was clearly evident to the priest. It is a tale from before the history of Riastais, from so long ago that I did not consider it essential for a young noble's education in these times. He bowed his aged head in apology, though Ludmilla also thought it was a reasonable decision. Bohdan settled into a more relaxed posture, putting his hands into his sleeves in front of him. During my training as an acolyte in the theocracy, he told her, before I came to be a missionary here, it was something that was taught. Keep in mind that this is from a century ago. The events and memory of the 13 heroes were still very much a recent thing in the hearts and minds of the people. Before the chaos that came with the advent of the demon gods, a group of faraway nations lost contact with their neighbors all at once. The investigations from the surrounding countries that were sent shortly after all reported the same dreadful findings. Each kingdom, to a man, had been transformed somehow into undead. Kingdoms much like our own, inhabited by millions, turned into an necropolis before anyone realized what had occurred. It is said that the dreaded vampire lord, Landfall, was also discovered there. Many of the more ardent adherents of Sir Sana amongst my peers firmly believed that the events were connected, a great ritual cast by an evil, ambitious individual to obtain immortality as one of the undead. It was a tale told in tones reminiscent of better times, when Ludmilla and her brothers sat in the hall of the manor listening to the old priest relate the histories of the world. A part of her took comfort in the familiar feeling, but her mind also worked to continue to stitch together what her tutor had shared with her own working knowledge. While she had not specifically known of the event that Bohdan had just disclosed, tales surrounding the 13 heroes spun by the bards and minstrels of the realm were still quite widespread and well received. She had heard the story of Landfall several times from different performers while visiting Erantle over the years. In one version, he was an unspeakably evil noble, whose atrocious actions against even his own people eventually led to his rise as a vampire. In another, he was an ancient horror that lurked in the shadows of cities and villages, preying on the people indiscriminately to quench his insatiable thirst for blood. In both tales, the vampire lord had brought about the ruin of entire nations through his actions, earning him the moniker Landfall. It was not until the 13 heroes confronted him that he was defeated and his reign of terror was brought to an end. There was a third version of the tale that suggested that he still lurked somewhere amongst the people, continuing to prey on the young women drawn helplessly by his charms, and that history would once again repeat itself someday. This last version was somehow the most popular amongst the women of the court. For her part, Ludmilla could not understand how anyone could feel that way about a creature that considered them food. By and large, however, the tale of Landfall was still an enthralling one, valiant heroes overcoming their vile adversary. Now that it was being applied directly to their own situation, however, it went from fantastical to nightmarish. Do you mean to say that this feudal paradine has performed such a ritual to become an elder lich? Ludmilla frowned as she voiced the unfamiliar term. And that the empire has similarly fallen to the undead? Bohdan nodded in affirmation. The precedent exists, he said, and based on Milivich's account, I find it not unlikely that this is what has occurred. This time, unlike the tales of the past, there were no legendary heroes to save them. Apparently, The only legendary figure of their time was the subject in question. The irony would have probably made her laugh helplessly if she wasn't preoccupied with the survival of the domain and its people. With a sigh, she finally relented. "Very well," she said. "I will organize the evacuation. Please let the people know." Bohdan nodded and bowed in gratitude. "Thank you, Mistress Ludmilla. You have made the right choice."